why the Iran ceasefire is a strategic defeat for America. Here is the image I want you to hold in your mind. Iran just got bombed for 40 days straight. Its supreme leader was killed on day one. Its nuclear facilities were struck by the most powerful bunker-busting bombs in the American arsenal. 9 million people fled the capital. The economy was in free fall. Missile stockpiles were cut in half. And then the ceasefire was announced, and the Iranian government went on national television and called it a great victory. Now, most people watching that heard one thing: propaganda. Of course they are going to spin it. Of course they are going to call it a win. What else are they going to say? But here is what I want to walk you through today. What if they are not spinning? What if, by the actual measures that determine who wins and who loses in a long-term geopolitical conflict, the Iranian government is telling the truth and the American government is the one doing the spinning? That is a confronting idea. I know that. But stay with me, because the evidence is harder to dismiss than you might expect. To understand what actually happened here, you need three things. You need to understand the history of what happens to powers that try to permanently subdue Iran. You need to understand what each side was actually trying to achieve in this conflict. And you need to look at the hard numbers that nobody in Washington is putting together in the same sentence. When you do all three of those things, the picture that emerges is not the one being shown on American television. Every empire that has tried to solve Iran has created a bigger problem than the one it started with. Every single one, without exception. Across 3,000 years of recorded history, Alexander the Great conquered Persia. Everybody knows that. What the history books move past quickly is what came next. Alexander died at 32. His empire fractured within a generation, and the Iranian Parthian dynasty rose from the wreckage and dominated the Middle East for the following 5 centuries. You can win the battle. Iran wins the century. Rome fought the Iranians, first the Parthians and then the Sassanid Persians, for over 300 years. Julius Caesar was planning an invasion of Persia when he was assassinated. Emperor Crassus led his legions east and was annihilated at Carrhae in 53 before the Common Era, one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman military history. Emperor Trajan pushed through, declared victory, watched revolts explode behind him, and retreated. Emperor Julian invaded in 363 and died in battle on Iranian soil. 300 years of war. Multiple emperors dead or humiliated, and the outcome, Rome fell. The Persian Empire was still standing. The Mongols in the 13th century were the most destructive military force in human history. They leveled Baghdad, they killed millions across Central Asia, they swept through Iran and left devastation behind them. And then the Mongol rulers of Iran, converted to Islam, became patrons of Persian art and poetry, built Persian mosques, and within 2 generations had been completely absorbed into the civilization they thought they had erased. They did not conquer Iran. Iran consumed them. Even the Soviet Union, a nuclear-armed superpower, occupied northern Iran during the Second World War and refused to leave when it ended. One of the first confrontations of the Cold War was Moscow versus Tehran over this occupation. Moscow withdrew. Tehran did not give an inch. This is not ancient mythology. This is a structural pattern that has repeated across every era, every technology, and every type of military power that has ever encountered Iran. The empires change, the outcome does not. Every power that tried to permanently solve the Iran problem eventually discovered that the problem it created by trying to solve it was larger than the one it started with. Now, bring that pattern forward to February 28th, 2026. To know who won this conflict, you first have to be honest about what winning meant to each side. This sounds obvious. It almost never gets done. America entered Operation Epic Fury with publicly stated goals: destroy the nuclear program, eliminate the missile industry, remove Iran as a strategic threat permanently. Trump said it plainly in his 8-minute address to the nation. Iran would no longer be able to threaten anyone. Underneath those stated goals sat a set of structural needs that were just as real: stable oil prices. Because American voters feel energy costs immediately and personally. Unquestioned military credibility globally, because that credibility is what keeps adversaries from testing American red lines. And eventually, a reduced footprint in the Middle East so that strategic resources could shift toward the genuine long-term challenge, which is China, not Iran. Iran's goals were completely different in kind. Iran has never believed it could defeat the United States in a direct military confrontation. Its entire strategic doctrine is built on not trying to do that. Instead, Iran spent 30 years building a framework designed around one central question: how do you make the cost of confronting you permanently higher than any benefit your adversary could realistically gain? The answer was the dispersed network of allied armed groups across the region, the patient accumulation of asymmetric military capabilities, and above all, the cultivation of the Strait of Hormuz as an economic weapon. Iran does not need to match American strength to make that waterway a lever. It only needs to be willing to bear the cost of holding it closed. And Iran spent decades demonstrating that its tolerance for cost is higher than Washington has ever been willing to credit. So now ask the only question that matters. Did this war and this ceasefire advance Iran's strategic goals or set them back? Let me give you the actual numbers, not projections, not estimates. Numbers from American institutions, from the Pentagon, from Congress, from think tanks that are not in the business of flattering Tehran. Pentagon officials told Congress that the first 6 days of the war cost the United States approximately $11.3 billion. By day 39, the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated total military expenditure at roughly $28 billion. Congressional sources told multiple outlets that at peak intensity, the daily burn rate was approaching $2 billion a day. $2 billion every single day, while Republican senators were simultaneously voting to cut Medicaid. But that headline number is not even the most damaging figure. The most damaging figure is the cost exchange ratio. An Iranian attack drone costs between $30,000 and $80,000 to build and field. The American interceptor missile required to shoot it down costs between $3 million and $10 million, depending on the system. The Defense Priorities think tank calculated the average ratio at 106-1. For every $1 Iran spent attacking, America spent $106 defending. Iran launched over 2,000 drones and more than 500 ballistic missiles. Do the math yourself. And then there is this detail that should stop every American taxpayer cold. A retired British military official who spoke to Al Jazeera described American forces being compelled to triage incoming threats, choosing which attacks to intercept with expensive missiles and which ones to let through, because the supply of high-end defensive weapons was running genuinely short. The most powerful military in human history was rationing its ammunition. In a war that lasted 40 days, beyond the defense budget, the economic damage radiated outward into every corner of American life. The International Energy Agency called the Strait of Hormuz closure the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Approximately 11 million barrels of daily oil production were cut off. The IEA authorized the release of 400 million barrels of strategic reserves, the largest emergency release ever recorded, and prices still hit over $110 a barrel. Every American who drove a car, paid a heating bill, or bought groceries was subsidizing this war in ways that never showed up in the Pentagon budget. The Penn-Wharton budget model put total direct and economic costs to the United States at between $40 billion and $210 billion once the full economic impact was included. Iran, for its part, was absorbing devastating physical destruction. But Iran was not paying $2 billion a day to stay in the fight. Now look at what the ceasefire document actually says. Because the terms of a ceasefire are not just a piece of paper. They are a confession. They tell you exactly where the leverage was sitting at the moment both sides decided to stop shooting. On March 25th, the United States sent Iran a 15-point ceasefire proposal through Pakistani intermediaries. Read that again carefully. The country that launched this war, the country with 40,000 troops and 2 carrier strike groups in the region, the country that spent $28 billion on bombing, was communicating with the country it was bombing through a third-party nation because it had no direct channel available. The American proposal asked Iran to accept limits on its nuclear program, constraints on its missiles, and a guarantee of free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. In exchange, America offered partial sanctions relief and some access to frozen Iranian assets. Iran rejected it without modification and sent back a 10-point counterproposal. Iran's document demanded that the United States formally recognize Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz and pay war reparations to cover the damage from American bombing. The country that had its supreme leader killed on day one was demanding that the country that killed him pay it compensation, and America returned to the table. The ceasefire Trump announced on April 7th was a 2-week pause mediated by Pakistan. Iran agreed to allow shipping through the strait during that window, but simultaneously, Iran and Oman announced they would charge transit fees on vessels using the passage, payable in cryptocurrency, with the funds earmarked for Iranian reconstruction. A country being bombed was levying tolls on an international waterway as a condition of briefly agreeing not to close it again. Less than 24 hours later, Iran closed the strait again, citing Israeli operations in Lebanon as a violation of the terms. The ceasefire Trump called total and complete victory was broken by Iran within 1 day. J.D. Vance called it a fragile truce. That word fragile is telling you something his boss would not say out loud. Here is the piece that inverts the entire narrative of American success. The stated primary purpose of this war was to eliminate Iran's nuclear threat. By that single measure, the war made the situation structurally worse. Before the conflict, Iran's nuclear program existed under imperfect but real international oversight. The IAEA had inspectors with regular access to declared facilities. The international community had a working picture of Iranian nuclear capabilities, incomplete but functional. After American bunker buster strikes on Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, the IAEA pulled its inspectors out entirely. It has not been able to verify the condition of the attacked sites, the location of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, or the operational status of its centrifuge programs. Nobody outside Iran knows how much was actually destroyed. Iran is not saying the IAEA cannot check. What satellite imagery does confirm is that Iran began accelerating construction on a deeply buried underground nuclear facility in the Zagros mountain range, a site that international inspectors have never been given access to. When the IAEA Director General asked about it, Iranian officials told him it was none of his business. Iran entered this war under real, functioning international nuclear oversight. Iran is exiting the ceasefire phase with essentially zero international nuclear oversight, an unknown surviving stockpile of highly enriched material, an accelerating underground construction program that has never been inspected, and a government now controlled by IRGC military hardliners who replaced the political figures killed in the opening strikes. The Arms Control Association concluded in March of 2026 that the American campaign had derailed both diplomatic progress and Iranian cooperation with the IAEA simultaneously without producing verifiable permanent destruction of Iranian nuclear capability. You cannot bomb away the knowledge, the engineers, or the decades of technical expertise that live in human minds. America bombed Iran's nuclear program. The result is an Iranian nuclear program that is more secret, more deeply buried, and less visible to the world than at any point in the past 20 years. For years, Washington talked about pivoting away from the Middle East. The strategic logic was compelling. China is the genuine long-term challenge to American power. Every carrier group in the Persian Gulf is a carrier group not positioned in the Pacific. Every $1 billion spent on Middle Eastern operations is $1 billion not competing with Chinese industrial and technological capacity. Before this war, America had over 10,000 troops distributed across bases in Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, plus 2 carrier groups. That was already a level of commitment that constrained everything else. Today, America has 40,000 military personnel in the region, 2 carrier groups, more than 200 aircraft representing the largest American airpower concentration in the Middle East since the Iraq invasion of 2003. Paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne on standby. A 2-week ceasefire requiring constant management to prevent collapse. Negotiations in Islamabad demanding senior diplomatic bandwidth. The pivot to Asia is not delayed. It is moving in reverse. Iran's entire strategic architecture, built patiently over 3 decades through proxy networks, asymmetric weapons, and the cultivation of Hormuz as a global pressure point, was designed to produce exactly this result. In America, too invested to withdraw and too exhausted to win decisively. And then consider what every government watching, from Beijing to Pyongyang to Moscow to Caracas, just observed. They watched America launch the largest air campaign in the region in 20 years. They watched Iran absorb it, hold the world's most important oil choke point for over 5 weeks, reject the American ceasefire proposal, submit its own counter demands, and sit down in Islamabad negotiating on its own terms. The message America intended to send was, cross our lines and face consequences you cannot survive. The message the world actually received was different. The message received was that if you can hold out long enough and make the cost high enough, the most powerful military on earth will eventually look for an exit before it achieves what it set out to do. That shift in perception does not fade. It compounds. Every adversary watching recalculates its own risk tolerance based on what they just saw. I want to be straight with you about what we do not know. We do not know how badly Iran's nuclear program was truly damaged. We do not know whether the new hardline Iranian government will be strategically coherent or increasingly reckless. We do not know whether the Islamabad talks produce a durable agreement or collapse in weeks. We do not know whether the Iranian population, absorbing real and severe economic pain, fractures the regime from the inside. These are genuine open questions, But here is what we do know. America spent $28 billion. 15 service members came home in coffins. Oil prices punished every household in the country for 40 days. America is more deeply embedded in the Middle East than at any point in over 2 decades, with no clear exit path. America proposed 15 conditions to end a war it started, got told no, and sat back down under Iranian terms. And the nuclear threat that justified the entire campaign is now operating in a more hardened, more secretive, and less internationally visible environment than it was before the first bomb fell. Iran is sitting in Islamabad with its hand on the switch that controls 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply, negotiating on the basis of its own proposal. 3,000 years of history taught Iran one lesson above everything else. You do not defeat an empire by matching its strength. You defeat it by compounding its costs until the price of staying becomes politically unbearable at home. America has spent 40 days finding out how precisely that lesson was learned. The war is not over. The outcome is not written. But if you look honestly at every objective America stated before the first bomb fell, and where each one of those objectives stands today, the picture does not look like a country that got what it came for. That is not Iranian propaganda. That is arithmetic.